Hello, I'm Ollie and this is CriminOlly, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, what I think is Stephen Graham Jones's best book yet, The Buffalo Hunter Hunter. Now, today's book is a vampire novel, and that got me thinking about today's sponsor, Serious Readers, and their high definition floor light. Now, this light uses what they call daylight wavelength technology, and it really is like having the sun shining on your page. It makes it so much easier to read, and I love reading using this light. But it got me thinking, if it uses the same wavelength as daylight, would it work on vampires in the same way that sunlight does? Now, Serious Readers certainly don't claim that on their website, but maybe it would. And if it did, that would be fantastic, because these lights are very easy to pose. You can direct the beam in any direction you want to if you are getting attacked by multiple vampires. You can also widen the spread of the beam, and you can change the force of it. You can make it softer or stronger. So I think if it did work against vampires, it would make a fantastic tool to defend yourself. If you're interested, do check out the link in the description to this video, and remember to use the code OLLY to get £150 off your first order. As I say though, they definitely don't claim that it works against vampires, so in the meantime I think I'm just going to stock up on garlic. Anyway, let's get back to today's review of The Buffalo Hunter Hunter by Stephen Graham Jones. So this book comes out next week in the US on the 18th of March and towards the end of April in the UK, so 29th of April in the UK. And if you are a horror fan, I definitely think it's worth checking out. It's a really interesting and enjoyable historical horror novel, and it's my favourite book I've read so far by Stephen Graham Jones. I wanted to start by talking a little bit about historical horror and why I think it works so well. This is a book that has a bit of a message to it. It's a book that's kind of about, a foundational period in US history. So it's set in 1912, so towards the end of the Western period, but in what we would recognise as the Wild West. So a really important time in American history, and a time that, has helped form America as the country it is today. I think horror has something, or often has something interesting to say about society and about humanity. And I think that's because, horror is about fear. It's about one of the most primal things inside us all. So it really taps into our humanity. So I think when horror adds into that a bit of commentary about society, it can be really, really powerful. And it's also, I think, always interesting and effective when novels which are basically, enjoyable, sensational stories add in a bit of commentary, about our lives. I think when a book sweeps you up in its story, sweeps you up in the events that it's going on, but has a message in the background, that message has a bit more power because you are really invested in the characters and the situations. So I think that kind of thing always works really well. And I think setting stories in a historical time period works really well for this kind of thing as well, because you can reflect on, you are describing the way things, or the author is describing the way things have happened in the past, and often the atrocities of the past. But because you are, as the reader, you are kind of reflecting back on a previous time period, I think it also makes you reflect on, how things are today. But it does it in a way which isn't really in your face. If you write a book that has, a strong message that's about today, that's about events of today, the book gets labelled as a message book, and that's the thing you go into it thinking. You go into it thinking that it's a book that's trying to sell you a message. When you set things in the past, I think that is diluted somewhat in your perception of the book as you go into it, and it therefore makes the message kind of sink in a little bit more. I think horror novels do that kind of thing really, really well, and I think historical horror novels do it particularly well. I was reflecting reading The Buffalo Hunter Hunter on another one that I'd read recently, The Reformatory by Tananarive Due, which is set in the 1950s, and again, describes atrocities. And I think that has the same kind of power. You get swept up by the story, you have a little bit of distance from the events because they took place in the past. And because of that, they sink in a bit more, and there's, it's a bit more digestible, but there's also a bit more emotion and a bit more power there. So I think both of these books do that really, really well. So I promise I will start talking about the actual book in a minute, but I also wanted to talk a little bit about Stephen Graham-Jones. So I think Stephen Graham-Jones is something of a divisive writer. He's someone who, some people really get on with his books, some people don't get on with his books. And I think even people who like some of his books don't necessarily like all of his books. So I have loved a couple of his previous books, The Only Good Indians and My Heart is a Chainsaw, but I didn't love the last book I read by him, which was I Was a Teenage Slasher. I thought it was fine, but I didn't think it was as good as the other books. So he's an author who can be a little bit divisive. Paul Tremblay, the horror writer, I think is a bit like that as well. I've found in comments that people have left on my videos about Paul Tremblay that people often love at least one of his books but don't like all of his books. And I wonder if that is perhaps the same with Stephen Graham-Jones. But I think The Buffalo Hunter is his most accessible book yet. So I think one of the problems, I think the problems people have had with his previous books is there can be something that kind of gets in the way of the story. So with The Only Good Indians, I think, and as I say, I love that book, but I think some people found the structure of it a little bit distracting. And with My Heart is a Chainsaw, that is a book that is like a slasher story, but it has loads of commentary about slasher movies in it. There are even kind of mini essays within it written by the main character about particular slasher films. And again, I think some people, whilst I personally loved it, I think some people found that distracted from the story a little bit. The Buffalo Hunter is more traditional in its structure and the way it's written, and I think is more accessible as a result. And also, I think it's a book, I think it's a fantastic book. I think it's a book, I would be very surprised if we don't see a movie or like streaming service adaptation of this. Because A, it's a really, really good story and it's really well done. It's got something interesting to say. But it's also in genres that seem to be having a bit of a moment at the moment. So horror is definitely having a moment at the moment. And there have been a lot of, well, there seem to me have been a lot of Western adaptations recently, particularly on like streaming services. So I think we may see a TV version of this soon, and I think that will be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, let me actually tell you what it's about. So it's an epistolatory novel, so a book that is told through stories and diaries and things like that. And it starts with a woman in the present day who is looking back at the events of the life of her, I think, grandfather or great-grandfather. And he was a preacher in, like a European preacher in the Old West. And he left a series of diaries, which he is kind of reading and digesting. But there are also another series of diaries which were written by someone he knew who was an Indigenous American. So you get these two sets of diaries, kind of together telling the story of what happened in the early 20th century. And they're both, they both have a distinct voice, which makes them really interesting. Now, where the horror part comes in is that the Indigenous American was bitten by a vampire, and the vampire character, like the kind of origin vampire character in this book, is fantastic. He's referred to, and I absolutely love this, as Catman by the characters, because he kind of moves like a cat. He has that kind of stalking presence to him. And there are some absolutely great scenes of kind of horror action involving Catman. So he has infected this character who is writing a series of diaries, and there are then also interactions between the Indigenous American character and the preacher character. So you get this kind of multi-layered story building up, and I'm not going to spoil it by telling you what happens beyond the kind of brief outlines of the plot that I've given, but you get this multi-layered, multi-voiced story building up, which is really, really nicely done. It's very effectively written, and I always find that style of storytelling really accessible. It just kind of works. You get into the characters' heads, and it's an effective way of giving different viewpoints on a story. There's this kind of trend in modern thrillers of having multiple characters, telling the story, which I always find a little bit, it feels a little bit forced. But when I think when you do it like this, when you do it with diaries and letters and things, it's really, really effective. And of course, Dracula, the classic vampire novel, is written in exactly this way. So I think Stephen Graham Jones is probably paying homage to Dracula a little bit in choosing this style, but I think it's really effective for the story. So you get here a book that is a really enjoyable horror story. It's got an interesting take on vampire lore. So the vampire lore is slightly different. I think I find that every new vampire book, does the vampire lore stuff in a slightly different way, and I find that really, really interesting, the way it just continues to develop and develop, and I think Stephen Graham Jones does that really well here. So some really good themes of horror. You really get into the lives of the characters. There's really an interesting reflection on what life in the Old West was like and how different it was for Indigenous Americans and European Americans. So I think that works very, very well. And I just found myself really swept up with the story, with the story, but also with the depiction of, life in early 20th century, kind of Western America. So I think it's, all in all, just a fantastically effective and interesting book. The thing that told me it was a really, really good book is that after I finished it, so I read it digitally. I was provided with a advanced review digital copy. When I went and looked online to see more information about the book, it's almost 500 pages long, and it didn't feel to me like a 500-page book at all. I was completely absorbed and swept up in it. It felt to me like about a 300-page book. I'm someone who often criticises books for being too long. This is a book that definitely didn't feel too long, despite being, of a pretty decent length. So all in all, a very effective and interesting book, and I definitely recommend it. So those are my thoughts on The Buffalo Hunter Hunter. I really do think it's an enjoyable and effective horror novel. Let me know in the comments if you're a fan of Stephen Graham Jones. Let me know if you think you're going to be reading this one. And as always, thank you very much for watching. I hope you're safe and well out there. I hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.